Hello, my name is Will Paradine. Welcome to my presentation on nationalism, invented tradition, and a very Russian opera. How Mikhail Glinka's music was given centuries of Russian pretext he didn't know it had. Mikhail Glinka's 1836 A Life for the Tsar was forged in nationalist sentiment backed by the Russian government and intelligentsia, and immediately propulsed throughout the Russian high circles as a flawless depiction of the empire's national character. It was the very first Russian opera to receive recognition in the West, and the first Russian opera at all, and began the long journey that tasked generations of Russian composers with the creation of a distinct nationalistic musical legitimacy. Glinka's second opera, Ruslan Ludmila, did not enjoy a similar widespread success, and was regarded as entirely un-Russian. However, decades later, it served as a stylistic foundation for the collected works of the Kuchka, the Five, under the guidance of Russian music critic Vladimir Stasov. In return, these compositions and essays constituted the largest and supposedly the most inherently Russian repertoire by which the majority of preceding Russian works were inspired. How and why did this shift in popular opinion occur? For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, it was believed that nationalism took root in the traditions of history. This was a narrative primarily sculpted and promulgated by heads of state, nobility, and highbrow artists, all of whom were set to gain from the widespread acceptance of a cemented nationalism. If this narrative were accurate, however, how could it be possible that such a small expanse of time had had such an overwhelming effect on the viewpoint Russians held in regard to Ruslan's nationalism? I am to shed light on the ideological shift that took place between the composition of A Life of the Tsar and the publications of the Kuchka. In so doing, I will clarify the nature of the Russian nationalistic narrative as an invented tradition riddled with inconsistencies and convenient truths. To accurately portray the evolution of the Russian national character, nationalism in the West must first be considered. In France, a new wave of liberalist culture alongside socio-political upheaval shook all of Europe, inspiring various similar revolts elsewhere. South of France, the Austrian Empire had been given full control of what is now Italy. Despite this, French champions of revolutionary ideology encouraged the people of Italy to view themselves as a fabric of a single united country. In the Germanic lands, Napoleon defeated Austria, the Holy Roman Empire dissolved, and from it blossomed a French-ruled puppet state. This French governance became a source for unification of its Germanic-speaking people. The Germans embraced their common language and similar cultural heritages not only as unique German characteristics of their own, but as qualities distinctly not French. Contemporary music followed and led in these nationalistic pursuits, providing the peoples of these aspiring nations with concrete symbols of unity. By the 1830s, most of the West had adopted Herderian notions of national character. Yet, it took the following 4 decades for Russia to follow suit. As the West progressed in music and technology, Russia remained stagnant and unsteadily aware of its shortcomings. Its efforts to modernize made Russia's relation with the West complicated. Its rulers alternated between an embrace of Western ideologies and a rejection of the West in favor of a Russian-style modernization. Both the Petrine court and that of Catherine the Great had made efforts at modernization and rehabilitation in the centuries prior to marginal success. In the late 1600s, Peter the Great began a movement of westernization which set the Europe-educated Russians even further apart from the serf. In the late 1700s, Catherine the Great encouraged a faulty nationalistic pursuit which invented a heavily romanticized depiction of Russian peasants, but still endorsed and encouraged Western ideals of Renaissance. In the early 1800s, under the rule of Nicholas I, personal freedom was extinguished as the nobility continued to westernize and industrialize while the serfs were left behind. This finally brought Russia within the same ballpark of Western industrial capacities, but sacrificed national identity in doing so. In pursuit of this national identity, Russian writers, Alexander Pushkin, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and their successors, were the first artists to cement the Catherinian tragic soul distortion of peasantry as the voice and experience of all Russians. Through this mythology, Russians began to frame themselves against the West, as the Germans did against the French. Russia posited the peoples of the West as cold, reason-driven, and poisoned by aspirations of commercial gain. In contrast, they supplied themselves as tragic souls in search of truth, at the mercy of fate. In this romanticization, the intelligentsia found comfort. In reality, however, this was a filtration of the declining prestige of Russian high class through the lens of European romanticism. Within this context, the overwhelming success of Glinka's A Life for the Tsar makes perfect sense. Recurring melodies throughout were based upon various stylized folk songs from the genre most popularly and excessively appropriated by the intelligentsia. This word here. Not only did the music of the serfdom serve as inspiration, the plot similarly centered on the mythologized peasant hero Ivan Suzanan. The theme of Russian heroism had long been central in the empire, and was propelled even further into the consciousness of the intelligentsia by the wildly successful Rostopchinsky posters. Only adding to a life's nationalist badge was his anti-West sentiment, contextually presented within the opera as anti-Pole. In its initial reception, audiences analogized the conflicts depicted in A Life with Russia's defenses against Napoleon earlier in the century. Summarized, the opera melded much of that with which Russians wanted to identify. Glinka's Ruslan and Ludmila didn't enjoy the same success. Under Nicholas I, Italian opera had become all the rage in St. Petersburg, the musical capital of Russia at the time. He displaced the Russian opera house to Moscow, then a musical backwater, to bring in an Italian opera troupe. At the staging of Ruslan and Ludmila, reception was poor and the opera was generally disliked. Part of the issue was the technical inability of the Italian opera orchestra, who were used to playing far less difficult Italian works. By 1848, Nicholas I banned all Russian operas from being performed at the Italian house. Glinka was so upset that he left Russia. Under the rule of Alexander II in the mid-1800s, public dissent was encouraged and the serfs were emancipated, while a new unified Russian identity was actively sought after. As time went on, A Life of the Tsar's appeal to a great Russia of the past no longer felt genuine or relatable. This created a void that Vladimir Stasov, a Russian music critic, and the Kuchka, a group of 5 Russian composers who would eventually come to define Russian musical identity, were perfectly positioned to fill. The Kuchka were actively concerned not only with nationalism, but with being perceived as the face of Russian nationalism. Their motives, of course, can only be speculated, though it seems very likely that they possessed a mix of genuine yearning for a nationalist musical language, as well as a calculated business strategy. Whatever the case, the historic and musical analysis that follows will identify them as propulsors of a new set of nationalistic ideals. As part of this new set of nationalistic ideals, Stasov and his 5 composer compatriots built with impressively little evidence the argument that Glinka's rather ill-received second opera was in fact itself the truest expression of Russianness in music that had ever been written. They did so with 3 main arguments. The first was plagiarism as a opposition to Russian perfect cadences. The second was omni-Russianness, although this was argued more by the Kuchka than by Stasov, and we'll get into that later. And then the third was a fusion of magic and epic opera, as well as the supernatural, which was meant to present a uniquely Russian type of opera. So before I get into these arguments they made, I just want to specifically define Erich Hobsbawm's invented tradition. So this is a phenomenon that has been talked about a couple different times with different terminology, but it was first identified in its concrete form to be used nowadays by British historian Erich Hobsbawm in a collection of essays he edited with Terence Ranger called The Invention of Tradition, a 1983 publication. An invented tradition, defined by the Oxford reference way more aptly than I could ever do myself, is something that has every appearance of being an actual tradition in that it repeats images and symbols drawn from the past, real or imagined, but it is in fact both of a relatively recent origin and artificially created. This concept perfectly encapsulates the musical and historical somersaults Stasov and the Kuchka perform in order to identify Ruslan and Ludmila as Russian. This isn't to say that Mikhail Glinka didn't mean for Ruslan Ludmila to have Russian imagery or nationalistic sentiment. It's just that Stasov and the Kuchka identified ways outside of what Glinka actually employed to this end. With the examples I will present, I aim to explore which attributes of the opera Stasov groomed in support of his philosophies and imparted to the Kuchka to be imbued into tradition. The first of these attributes is plagiarism, the brainchild of Stasov and his friend Bilkhirev, who would later form the Kuchka. Plagiarism developed under a new concept of Russian harmony. This concept, which Stasov framed primarily as dignified opposition to Western practice, is drawn from a fairly unfounded and meandering justification. As one might expect, the theory of Russian plagiarism purports that Russian music is dominated by the plagal 4-to-1 cadence and not the perfect 5-to-1. As explained in Marina Furlova-Walker's Russian Music and Nationalism, the main support for this argument Stasov found in Russian folk music. Grounded in the notion that music of the serf class had not yet adopted the Western major-minor duality, preferring instead the older system of ecclesiastic modes, Stasov stipulated that the perfect cadence had not yet cemented itself in Russian tradition. His reasoning continued. This lack of universal dominant function led to the relative prominence of the plagal cadence in the folk-influenced Russian high music. Hermann Laroche tied the final knot for this argument by implicating Glinka's compositions. In an 1867-68 article, Laroche asserts that Glinka's use of ecclesiastic modes in his harmonizations within Ruslan, particularly a 4-1 motion in the opening overture, must have been a result of Glinka's childhood familiarity with folk tunes. Since Glinka had no previous knowledge of modality, Laroche explains that Glinka must have naturalized into his musical vocabulary the modalisms that Russian folk music had retained. So, does this argument have any historical basis or reason to it? No, of course not. This is 1800s music critics we're talking about. One particular point critics held against Stasov, Belokirov, and Laroche's line of reasoning can be extrapolated from a work by Stasov himself. In an 1858 open letter to Franz Liszt and A.B. Marx, Stasov detailed the increased usage of modal harmony in Western composers from Beethoven onwards. Stating every musical gesture, from a 1-5 to a 6-1 in the middle of a phrase, anything that was not a 5-1 as an example of plagiarism, he announced Glinka as equal to Beethoven and Chopin, and that the Russian had arrived at a similar modal construction. This was to incorrectly imply that Glinka had applied modality, unaware of its implementation by the greats. Glinka, in fact, was quite well versed in the compositions of the West, having grown up in the Europe-educated upper class. The overture I cited in the last slide, from Ruslan and Ludmila, rather than having been taken from Russian folk music, was inspired most likely by a staging of Rossini's Mosè in Egitto. Its opening hosts the same progression. It is difficult to reconcile Stasov's awareness of modalisms in the West, along with his familiarity with Glinka's life, through direct friendship with the composer, with the crutch of Glinka's ignorance upon which Stasov's argument was bolstered. A quote by Furlova Walker eloquently spells all argument of Glinka Russian ecclesiastic modality. Glinka's harmony has been called so novel and fresh because it has been measured against a straw man of Western harmony, which degenerated in the course of the polemic onslaught to a mere alternation of tonic and dominant chords. Stasov, Belokirov, and Laroche's nationalist essentialism is a prime example of invented tradition, as defined by Hobsbawm. Stasov's idealistic assertions attempted to establish continuity with a suitable historical past. Of such nature, no continuity existed. There is no impervious way to prove the ecclesiastic modes had never informed Russian folk music. Even as such, it stands true that they held little influence over Ruslan and Ludmila, and served as inspiration to a life only in a stylistically westernized form. In this state, any trace of modality had vanished. As I mentioned earlier, the second attribute of Ruslan and Ludmila destined to influence the Kuchka was not strongly promulgated by Stasov, but it had previously taken root in Russian literature, the concept of omni-Russianness. By the 1820s, Pushkin, who wrote the poem upon which Glinka based Ruslan and Ludmila, and his contemporaries asserted that he, Pushkin's, poetry possessed a universality of character. What does that mean? According to the first positor of this theory, Ivan Kryevsky, Pushkin, like the Russian people at large, could forget himself in the surrounding phenomena and currently experienced moment. This translated into a so-called natural ability to express from the perspective of a Belgian, a Finn, a Spaniard, or any other. Though this is seemingly antithetical to nationalism, to speak of a universal human spirit, the concept managed to find its home in an imperial rather than a nativist Russian nationalism. This imperial Russian nationalism asserted that Russia had the unique ability to conquer the world by absorbing and regurgitating other cultures through its own, thereby allowing the world to maintain its mosaic of disparate peoples while donating, quote-unquote, to these people the honor of rejoicing all the same in Russian national pride. Simply put, Pushkin, Kryevsky, and other Russian elite performed ideological somersaults to make Russianness synonymous with non-Russian features. It naturally followed, then, that Glinka's musical setting of Pushkin's poetry presented a similar omni-Russianness, jumping from Finnish caves, starring a Finnish sorcerer named Finn, to ancient Kyiv palaces, to oriental enchanted gardens, to northern Caucasus mountains, and more. How else was omni-Russianness supposedly present in Ruslan and Ludmila? Though more open to interpretation than the music, set design and costumes were equally international and ornate, so too were the range of characters. Musically, Ruslan presented a collection of pan-continental genres, unprecedented in Russian opera, from Persian arabesques to Finnish ballades to Arabian, Turkish, and Circassian dances, and so forth. Specific harmonic and melodic motives, as opposed to formal structures, however, were less numerous. Despite it directly contradicting Stasov's aim to achieve stylistic distinction from the West, he never opposed omni-Russian ideology, and engaged with it subvertly with different terminology. This was perhaps strategic, allowing two contradictory arguments of Russian nationalism to exist concurrently within the same piece of music. No matter the case, omni-Russianness was accepted and promoted through Pushkin and Glinka's Ruslan and Ludmila's. It is interesting to note that no musical or literary historical tradition is called upon in support of omni-Russianness. In this light, the concept is a more complex, and/or unfounded, form of invented tradition than plagiarism. The idea of omni-Russianness being intrinsic to the Russian people of course supported its legitimacy, but was fairly peripheral to the ideology's supposed output, the poems and compositions themselves. As I've already mentioned, Stasov never actually directly implicated himself with omni-Russianness. However, one particular motive caught the ear of Stasov, who argued for its omni-Russianness though he used terminology that wouldn't clash with his nativist Russian nationalism. It has since been referred to under a range of names, including the Kuchka pattern, KP, and the Russian submediant among them. The KP progression is characterized by a chromaticism from the dominant to the subdominant back to the dominant, 5, sharp 5, 6, flat 6, 5, normally over a static bass. Stasov argued Glinka used a progression to musically codify Orientalism. However, this is much too clean-cut an argument than what reality serves. In truth, throughout the opera, Glinka never completes the progression in one go, only in fragments. Further, Glinka doesn't restrict its application to only what they would have called Oriental characters or themes. It is equally prevalent throughout the opera. In Finn's ballad, both halves of the KP progression are present, though reversed, yet Finn is decidedly Finnish, quite obviously far removed from Oriental imagery. Despite this, Stasov firmly stood by the Russian-Oriental association based on this one progression. By nature of his influence on the Kuchka, however, his hypothesis became reality, and so the Kuchka inaugurated Oriental exoticism alongside the KP into Russian nationalistic music, becoming a staple of Russian sound. This sort of tradition-making, as it coincides with nationalism, was a self-fulfilling prophecy. When first proposed, KP as Orientalism was entirely unfounded, but as more contributors to the Russian musical language utilized the KP and other supposedly Oriental-sounding musical features, it became common practice, compounding falsehood until it became true. In the current Russian canon, the KP has garnered Oriental associations in work by Rachmaninoff, Rimsky-Korsakov, Balakirev, Tchaikovsky, Borodin, Glazunov, etc., as well as composers outside of Russia trying to evoke its spirit, such as Debussy. A third attribute of Ruslan and Ludmila can be found in the plotline's fairy tale and supernatural qualities, as well as in the ambiguity between magic and epic operatic genres. Each of the Kuchkin composers, most notably Rimsky-Korsakov, utilized and centralized supernatural qualities in their works, and many of the composers wrote epic operas as well. Just to return to the ambiguity of differentiating epic from magic opera, it might be helpful to situate the comparison in the history of Russian dramatic genres and the goals of Stasov and the Kuchka. The magic drama had long been a tradition in Russia, but didn't provide the level of folk association and versatility in its pre-existing form as the Kuchka wanted. In any case, Frolova Walker wrote, they were concerned to present Ruslan as a solitary act of genius without precedent, so far above other Russian operas that it would be impertinent to talk of influence. In creating the genre of epic opera to replace that of magic, the Kuchka allowed themselves leeway in this framing of Ruslan, as well as Russian operas to follow. This rebranding, though convenient, undermined the legitimacy of the nationalism Stasov and the Kuchka preached. It was simply not a genre based in folk tradition. Generally hitched to the talk of Russian musical supernaturalism is the whole tone scale. This association is directly due to Glinka's original connection of the two, though I will only touch on it briefly. Let it be known that the harmonic and melodic basis was invaluable in the establishment of late Romantic Russian and later international musical lexicons. Almost the exact same list of composers who used the KP made use of the whole tone scale. In Ruslan, Glinka restricted his composition with the whole tone scale to a leitmotif for the evil sorcerer Chernomor. This humble application of the whole tone scale was elaborated upon by the Kuchka, with the augmented triads of the scale serving not only as a color, but as a doorway into a new harmonic world. Regardless of the practitioner, since Glinka, the whole tone complex has almost always retained its traditional association with the wicked and the fantastic. So, why did the Kuchka and Stasov go to such trouble and such lengths to create this image of Ruslan? Ruslan, being Russian, conveniently defined Russian music to be very similar as the music the Kuchka wanted to write, which helped to legitimize them. In all, Glinka's Ruslan and Ludmila presents a curious case for Russian nationalism. However, adopting Hobsbawm's notion of invented tradition, the turmoil of Ruslan and Ludmila's experience in its distinct phases of reception is more easily understood. At first, Glinka's original nationalistic intentions for the opera were entirely lost by Ruslan's reception. Later, Stasov and the Kuchka took to the work like wildfire, presenting everything from entirely outlandish hypotheses to supposable fact. This was intended to instill in the minds of their compatriots the specific Kuchka brand Russian nationalism. Within this framework, they could indulge in an inherent worth, allowing them to legitimize and promote their own work. Finally, in that Stasov and the Kuchka were successful in their quest to nationalize Ruslan and Ludmila in their own image, and in that they were even more successful in creating an oeuvre of accompanying works, many of the national traditions they molded from thin air codified into practice. This made them traditions, if historically faulty, in their own right. So, they made it up 170 years ago. Is it Russian now? At the danger of posing too large a question, at what point does a particular tradition, regardless of its validity and conception, homogenize into all others as equally founded? Thank you very much for listening to my slightly long presentation. If you have any questions, ask away. And if not, this is William Paradine finally signing off.